Now, I haven't seen this much hype and anticipation for a film since The Force Awakens and Deathly Hallows Part 2, and as of this video, Avengers Endgame has had the greatest opening of all time. Now, we've all grown up with the MCU, and whether you love it or hate it, you can't deny it has been one of the most innovational and most successful film franchise of all time. We've seen the cinematic universe formula, which was so excellently perfected by Marvel, been poorly imitated by that abomination called the DCEU, and by Universal's Dark Phoenix, or whatever the fuck they call it. This is a film that's been built up for 11 years. Was released shortly after the tragic death of Stan Lee. Rest in peace. This is a sequel to Infinity War, one of the greatest superhero films of all time. And to finally witness the end to this 22-film story arc was something we've all been eagerly awaiting for. All the end credit scenes, all the fan theories, they were finally going to pay off. This was it. This was the last film you needed to see if you were about to die. This was the second coming of Jesus. This was our cinematic equivalent to Half-Life 3 being released. Now, before we get into this review, which will have spoilers because I'm not going to make some obligatory spoiler-free review in which I'm unable to review the film properly, since I might give something away for the few people who should have seen it already. Look, there's 24 hours in a day. It's a 3-hour movie. The movie ticket is $15. The film is worth your time and money. Go watch it so it can beat Avatar at the box office. It's not that big a sacrifice. Now, before I get right into the review, I need to confess something. For the longest time, I actually promised myself that I would not be watching this film. In fact, the first video on this channel was originally going to be why I won't be watching Avengers Endgame, and one of the reasons for this being the movie Captain Marvel, which was the first and only film in the MCU I have not seen. I deliberately chose to avoid it because I knew just how awful the film was going to be. I know it sounds ignorant judging a film by not seeing it, but hear me out. The comics the titular character was based on are utter garbage, and when you're adapting something from an established material that is severely lacking in quality, chances are so will the adaptation. We all knew she was going to be in Endgame anyway, and I found the idea of a retconned, newly introduced, all-powerful Deus Ex Machina character coming in out of nowhere and saving the day without any faults and robbing the victory of the real heroes of the MCU that we've all come to love to be disrespectful to the series. This was their fight, not hers. But the real reason in which why I was so hesitant to watch this film was my love for Infinity War. I remember right after watching that film in the theater for the first time, I said, I don't care what the rest of the MCU has to offer, because for me, Infinity War was just such a great way to end the franchise, even though it did end on a cliffhanger. I mean, this is one of the few films in which the villain actually won. Thanos 100% succeeded in his plan, and not in the way the Joker's plan did in The Dark Knight, in which as long as Batman took the blame for what Harvey Dent did, technically the Joker's plan fails. Hell, Joker didn't even show up in the sequel. What the heck? That doesn't make any narrative sense. Anyway, and I was okay with Thanos winning, mainly because we had seen our heroes get out of just about every situation beforehand, and to see them fail at their most dire moment was just such a clever, surprising twist that I don't think any of us had ever seen before. However, I think my love for Infinity War eventually turned into a fear that Endgame would never be able to live up to the expectations it had set up. And we all knew everyone that died by the Thanos staff would come back to life, which, to be honest, I wasn't really okay with. Mainly because it's a huge pet peeve of mine anytime you bring back dead characters back to life. For me, it just removes the tension and stakes of the story and kind of makes their death almost meaningless in the first place, since, they're just going to come back to life anyway. And also, I think this gave the film a certain amount of predictability. And the fear of it not being as great as I wanted it to be also haunted me. I couldn't bear the thought of the series ending on anything other than a high note. So for a while, I decided not to find out. However, as time went on, I realized that my decision for avoiding Endgame due to my fear of potential disappointment was a rather ignorant decision. I knew at the very least it would be an above-average film, as most Marvel films are, and that deep down I did want to see what happened to our characters after the events of Infinity War and how they would be able to deal with its aftermath. I also knew that there would be an inevitable onslaught of spoilers that would be unleashed after the film's release, as the same thing happened with Infinity War, and that would eventually alter my perception of the film. And on its opening weekend, I decided to go back on my decision, and I finally witnessed it. The finale to this 11-year-long franchise. And needless to say, all my fears had been put to rest. Now with that all out of the way, let's just break right into this. The film has a great opening. It picks up right during the end of Infinity War, in which we see Hawkeye spending some nice quality time with his family, only for them to disintegrate right during the Thanos snap. What makes the scene great is that we get to see more effects of the snap and how it affects average people going about their everyday lives. Throughout the film, they keep referring to this as if it were a terrorist attack, and rightfully so, as it did wipe out trillions upon trillions of lives in a matter of seconds. That's what's always made the MCU so great, the fact that there are realistic consequences for all these events that have taken place, and that they're able to bring all these larger-than-life situations down to earth for the most part. And the scene itself is also a little sad and tragic. Hawkeye doesn't even see them disintegrate. He turns around to get something for a second, and when he turns back around, they're gone. He thinks it's a joke at first, and that they're hiding or something, only for him to start panicking when he can't find them. He doesn't obligatorily yell, "No!" or something equally stupid at the sky when he realizes they're gone. And the thought that countless similar scenarios are happening all over the universe makes the snap even more frightening. In a way, the snap is, for me at least, a dark version of the revelation, but instead of being chosen for salvation, they are instead condemned to damnation, or in this case, disintegration. Now, as I said before, one of the things I was worried about in this film was the inclusion of Captain Marvel. I was afraid she would ruin the film, but I gotta say, I was genuinely relieved to discover how little she's actually in it. She's hardly in the film at all, and has maybe about 10-ish minutes of total screen time in this 3-hour movie. And that's me being generous. She has so little impact on the overall plot, you could essentially cut/write her out of it, and the film would literally be no different. All you would really need to do is rewrite part of the beginning, in which, instead of her saving Tony Stark and Nebula in space, you would just have to where, like, the ship crashes on Earth, and the crash could still lead to Tony being injured in the same manner, so that really wouldn't change anything. And you wouldn't really even need to destroy the massive ship during the climax, since it would just be wiped out with Tony using the stones, or you could just have Thor, even Captain America, bring it down with a hammer. And to be honest, the scenes she's in, you don't really see any of the other characters interact with her, or even acknowledge her, except for like a few. However, to be fair, there was a quick little nice moment where she says hi to Spider-Man that did genuinely make me smile. I thought, you know what, that was a nice little moment. That being said, I did think Brie Larson's performance was pretty bad in the rest of the very limited scenes she was in. I mean, there's this awful, cringeworthy line of dialogue she delivers during the scene in which one of the Avengers says, I believe it's War Machine says, "How are we gonna beat Thanos this time?" And she says something like, "Oh, you have me." And it's like, just shut up! It also doesn't help that she has that repulsive haircut she had in the comics. Oh well, I guess her inclusion was inevitable after all, since her movie did make over $1 billion. And at the end of the day, she is still hardly in it, so I guess I can't complain too much. And speaking of inevitable, let's talk about Thanos. For me, he was the best part of Infinity War by far, since the whole film revolved around him. And for me, he was essentially the main character, which I thought was such a groundbreaking innovation, that a superhero film of this scope and size could focus on the villain, who was a big CGI purple alien, who at the end of the day, his motivation was just to kill people, to be the most interesting character. So naturally, I was looking forward to see what direction they would be taking his character in. He obviously wouldn't go back and try to pick a fight with our heroes. That would be out of character for him. I mean, he accomplished his life's goal. So, what more is there left for him to do? At this point, he should just retire since he's won, and that's exactly what he does. we get a beautiful scene where we see Thanos just living out the rest of his days on a farm of all places. It's a prime example of show don't tell, as even though the scene itself is relatively short, we know everything that is happening without any dialogue. None of his forces are around, no alien technology anywhere, except his armor being used as a makeshift scarecrow. He's retired now, and is just alone and satisfied with what he has done as he peacefully gathers crops on his farm to prepare a stew or something. It's a fitting resolution to his character as he's now just done with it all, and when the Avengers get the jump on him, he hardly resists or even fights back, and the revelation that he destroyed the stones makes perfect sense. They were the only thing capable of undoing his entire plan, and since they fulfilled their purpose, what more would he need them for? He clarifies this by saying this great line where, like, he says, they serve no purpose other than temptation. And it took me completely by surprise when Thor just, like, decapitates him. I think it was fitting since, of all the characters, I think he had the biggest grudge against Thanos. I mean, Thanos killed Loki, he killed Heimdall, and most of the other Asgardians right in front of him. He had wiped out all but one of the dwarves in that place in Infinity War, I forgot what it's called. And he severed Peter Dinklage's character's hands. There is a twist of irony in his death, as Thor promised he would kill Thanos himself, as well as he said he would go for the head after doing so. And even though he dies early on in the film, the writers managed to cleverly reincorporate him later in the story that doesn't feel arbitrarily forced or shoehorned in, like, oh, we gotta have Thanos so we can sell those Thanos toys. I'll talk more on that later, but for right now, let's just go over the rest of the plot and characters. Now, shortly after his death, the film does a 5-year time jump, which I thought was such a great way for the plot to go in. I mean, what more could they have done? They've already avenged everyone by killing Thanos, and with the stones gone, any chance of bringing them back was gone, so naturally, all they could do was simply move on. The world isn't post-apocalyptic by any means, but it is still recovering from the aftermath of the snap, and I love the way the world and Avengers are dealing with it. We see Captain America at a survivors group, there's tons of memorials everywhere, Hawkeye's killing criminals that didn't die in the snap in order to cope with the loss of his family since he views them living as unfair. Hulk has basically taken his Professor Hulk identity from the comics, in which Bruce Banner now lives in the Hulk's body, and is now loved by the population, which is a refreshing change that people now love him, as they used to be, like, afraid of him. This is about as human as the Hulk can get without him actually being in human form, especially since in this film the Hulk, the CGI on the Hulk is made to look more like Mark Ruffalo in any previous film. I thought what they did with Thor in this film was genius. He's now an overweight alcoholic, and for some people this might be too much or it's a betrayal of his character, but for me I think it works perfectly within the context of the film. For one, it's funny throughout the film until you realize that this is just his way of coping. He's now a shadow of his former self, and he's had just about everything taken from him by Thanos, and once he got his revenge, there's also little for him to do now. It is revealed in this film that there are other Asgardians that survived Thanos' attack, but like Thor, what more could they do? They've already provided with food and shelter in Norway, but would never again match to what they had in Asgard, so like him, all they could do is move on. And with all this free time on his hands, it makes sense that Thor would just relax and spend all his time procrastinating. Besides, him being more drunk and overweight makes him more Viking-like anyway, so. And as funny as it does lead into the worst scene in the entire film, and that's the scene where it's him and his friends playing Fortnite. Need I say more? This is also kind of scary considering the fact that that means that this game will be relevant within 5 years from now. But for whatever reason, if you like Fortnite, I guess this won't bother you in any way, so. Anyway, and then we have Tony Stark, who, similar to Thanos, has also retired, and he is now finally settled down and lives in a wooden lodge in the middle of the woods, and has even had a child with Pepper Potts, which leads to some great emotional scenes. In a way, he is also at peace, since, like Thanos has done all he could to do, to accomplish his goals, except, well, he was not successful. Now all he can do is move on with his life. This is all kind of foreshadowed earlier in the film, as he was the only Avenger not to go after Thanos, which further implies that he's just done with it all. You can tell he's still feeling the guilt over Spider-Man's death. He was like a son to him, which hurts him even more. And later, when the rest of the Avengers find a way to fix everything and ask him for his help, he's still in denial and wants nothing to do with it. I think this just further adds to the whole message of loss that both this and Infinity War have. Now, the central plot of this film does involve a lot of time travel, which I was not on board with at first, mainly because I just don't like a lot of time travel stories in general, just because the rules they set up for it fall apart when you think about it. And most of the time, the motivation for traveling through time is just trying to prevent some tragedy, which I think holds back character development. How can a character develop from his or her mistakes if they can just go back and prevent them? So you just end up with a bunch of plot holes and a headache trying to figure it all out. But Endgame is an exception. I gotta say, I really love their version of time travel. It all makes sense for the most part. Instead of trying to go back and prevent the snap, they're trying to go back and snatch the Infinity Stones at key points in history before Thanos gets them. Nothing they do is actually affecting the present in any way, so basically they're just traveling to parallel timelines. And them going back to previous events in the MCU makes this film very nostalgic in a way. The film is basically just a giant love letter to everyone who has stuck with this franchise for so long. It's nowhere near a parody by any means, but the film is a little self-aware in a way. For example, remember all those memes about how Ant-Man could kill Thanos by shrinking inside him and growing? Well, that doesn't happen for obvious reasons, but he is in a way directly responsible for his demise. Think on it. Without him, this whole time heist would have never come into fruition, and we wouldn't even have a film, to be honest. And the film makes fun of other fan theories in a way, like when War Machine says they should go back in time and just kill baby Thanos. His idea is shot down, since that obviously wouldn't work, as changing the past does nothing to the present. There's also a ton of little Easter eggs and references to the comics that I thoroughly, enjoyed. Like, I noticed how Iron Man's armor resembles the armor he wore in the 60s comics, and how Thanos co-creator Jim Starlin makes a cameo. Oh, that was cool. Even though this is the most comic booky superhero film I've ever seen, I thought it was also really interesting how the overall plot wasn't based on any storyline from the comics, so I just thought that was really neat. But anyway, once they actually go back in time, it was at this point when I knew, no, this is the right decision. We had gotten nothing but just tons of great character development for a large part of the film, which is great since for about the first half of the film, our heroes aren't really even in costume at all. It was great to see them just being people, just being human. But now seeing them come together in their final and most important mission was sort of like a dream come true. Now, anytime a franchise does a prequel, flashback, or just shows anything involving previously established continuity, a lot of the time they do a really unconvincing job of making everything look like the way it did back then. A main reason for this being is that the visual/art styles are always changing since technology is always getting better. The Star Wars and Halo franchise are probably the worst offenders of this. Just about everything that takes place in the past looks more advanced and has better technology, and just looks better. And this can be really distracting and irritating to longtime fans and people who focus on details. But Endgame doesn't make any of these mistakes, for the most part, and it's really refreshing to finally see this done in a franchise. The fact that when they travel back to the Battle of New York from the first Avengers movie couldn't be a better example of this. When they go back, everything looks just like the way it did in Avengers. They all have the same costume. Hell, even Captain America is still in that lame, cheap suit he had in the movie. The same thing applies to all the other events they go back to. They didn't just fill these scenes with pointless callbacks and cameos like, remember this? It's more like they're viewing these events through different perspectives. Such as when they're all viewing Loki's arrest, we get new scenes of their older counterparts dealing with the situation. One of the coolest scenes to come out of this was when present-day Captain America goes in the elevator to retrieve the Mind Stone, and we literally get a callback to that amazing elevator fight from Winter Soldier. They even have the same extras in the background. I just thought, wow, what a great attention to detail. The only time the film doesn't resemble the way events looked back then is when Thanos and his forces return, and they look just the same way they did in Infinity War. But you would come up with reasons for this, like, well, he probably just got back from fighting. And it's such a minute detail that it doesn't really affect anything on the overall plot, so I'm not even going to touch on it, really. Anyway, them going back to past events leads to some of the most emotional scenes in the entire film, and in completely unexpected ways. When they travel back to the events of Thor 2, Thor has a genuine heartfelt moment with his mother, which took me completely by surprise since, to be honest, I forgot she existed. I never in my life thought anything involving Thor, the Dark World, would emotionally move me. And even though some people said this goes against his character arc in Thor Ragnarok, I still couldn't help but feel happy for when he gets Mjolnir back. Since after all, he was such a shadow of his former self. Just seeing him still be worthy was kind of satisfying in a way. And two hammers are better than one, so why not? And speaking of emotional moments, remember that scene from Infinity War where Thanos had to kill Gamora, his own daughter, just to get the Soul Stone? Well, Endgame somehow manages to top that scene in a similar way in terms of emotional weight. This time, it's Black Widow and Hawkeye who go to Vormir. It's still just as cool and shocking to see the Red Skull again, even though he's not played by Hugo Weaving anymore. But what makes this scene better for me is that unlike the scene in Infinity War, Gamora was basically forced into being sacrificed by Thanos. This time, one of them has to sacrifice themselves out of their own will. Like the Red Skull said, a soul for a soul. And it makes sense that they would fight each other over who gets to sacrifice themselves. After all, someone has to die. Out of the original core Avengers, both of them are probably the most human since they have the least amount of power. But when Black Widow sacrifices herself, not only is it just as sad, but it also makes a lot more sense when you think on it. The whole point of collecting the stones was to bring back all of the dead, among these being Hawkeye's family. It would be just as equally devastating for them to live without him, for him to live without them. And in a dark way, she kind of has less to live for, so it makes sense why she would sacrifice herself. And there are no cop-outs. She stays dead. And to add on all this, they even have the same score from the scene in Infinity War play in the background, which is perfectly, especially when Hawkeye wakes up in the pond with the Soul Stone in his hand, akin to that scene in which Thanos did it. One of the best things about all the emotional moments in this film is just how natural they feel. They never once feel unearned, and they never beat you over the head or try to emotionally manipulate the audience, as it would be really easy to do so in a film like this. Though we all know this isn't the last installment in the MCU, it is the concluding chapter in the 11-year Infinity Saga. So if there's any film in the series that's meant to be the most emotionally heart-pounding, it's this one. Such as during the scene in which Tony Stark runs into his father while getting the Tesseract. The film could have played up the scene just to get some cheap, sad, emotional response from the audience, but no. It simply plays it off as just two characters having a conversation. You can tell Tony wants to tell him he's his son, but he can't. He never had the closure with his father. This is the closest chance he'll get. And I like how his father subtly explains, / foreshadows the way his future son will be in this scene. Even though the film is filled with a lot of emotional moments like these, it still manages to inject some humor into this dire situation that doesn't feel like lazy comedic relief as they do just about all the other films in the MCU. It also does so by poking fun at other events in the franchise when they go back in time, like when Captain America fights his past self, and when Nebula and War Machine go back to the opening of Guardians of the Galaxy. For me, this is probably the funniest scene in the entire film, since without the music playing, Star-Lord just looks like an idiot dancing to nothing. And it's even more hilarious when they just knock him out. From this point on, this does lead into how Thanos returns in the film. I was wondering how the film was going to reincorporate him back into the plot, and I gotta say, I love the way they did it. Them time traveling to this point in the series also adds to the believability, since besides this film and Infinity War, Guardians of the Galaxy was his only other film in the series in which his appearance wasn't just a cameo or an end credit scene or something like that. He is still just as menacing as his future self when he enters, especially with that massive, awesome double-edged sword thing, which kind of becomes a signature weapon for the rest of the film. It's no Infinity Gauntlet, but it'll do. I also like how even though this is his past self, the film still manages to develop his character. When he finds out about the future through Nebula, you can tell he's in a way content that he succeeded in his plan, but he knows he can't let it all be undone. So it makes sense that he would change his plan and travel to the future now that he has the perfect opportunity laid out in front of him. Now, as I saw the film, I was still skeptical on whether or not I would still be okay with them bringing back all the people who died in Infinity War, but because of all the sacrifices the Avengers had made to retrieve the stones, and all the incredibly well-written, emotional character drama, I was more than willing to accept this. I feel like they earned it, and that at the end of the day, this is something that had to be done. Something that needed to be done. This scene in which they bring everyone back was also very well done. There's a lot of suspenseful build-up as they lock down the compound. Hulk puts on the new Iron Man Infinity Gauntlet, which I just love the design of, by the way. And you can just tell how painful it is for him just to try and snap his fingers while wearing it, and that it breaks his arm and afterwards he just passes out. The 2014 past Nebula, bring back Thanos and his ship at the same time, also added a lot more suspense during this scene. It was just jaw-dropping to see Thanos' ship just fire a barrage of energy missiles, whatever, that just completely obliterate the Avengers compound and the surrounding land. No one dies from this, which I guess you could say is a little convenient, but it is still jaw-dropping just because of how sudden it is. Now, all of this leads right into the film's climax. For me, the climax slash final battle is divided into two distinct parts. The first part being the fight between the three main Avengers, that being Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor, against Thanos. The second part being what the fans have all wanted to see for the past 11 years. Like the rest of this 3-hour film, it's all perfectly paced and doesn't drag on for too long. And saying this is all just satisfying would be one of the biggest understatements I've ever heard. For one thing, the setting of it all just looks beautiful. It has a very post-apocalyptic feel to it due to the destruction of the compound. And Thanos' giant ship ominously hovering over all this gives it a massive sense of scale and dread. When the three main Avengers meet with Thanos, it feels like there's just so much history between all of them, even though technically this is the first time Thanos has even met them. And the godlike speech he says when he announces his plan to remake the universe makes him even more menacing and threatening. And the dialogue written is infinitely more well written and interesting than any garbage monologue written by Shakespeare. The fight between them itself is easily the best in the entirety of the MCU. It's incredibly well choreographed. It's not just some stupid brawl from those god-awful DC movies, where it's just a bunch of, CGI people punching each other through poorly rendered CGI backgrounds. It feels grounded and real. When Captain America was able to lift Thor's hammer, that felt like a very well-deserved crowd-pleasing moment. It didn't feel like it was just there for the sake of fan service, and it was kind of hinted at in previous films like Age of Ultron. And it's thematically fitting how Thanos retaliates for this by cracking his shield in half, which for me I always thought the sight of Captain America's shield being broken to be visually poetic as a broken icon. It's like seeing the American flag being burned. Now, the second part of the climax was what the fans always wanted to see. And boy, does it not let down for 1 second. Seeing all the dead characters come back, especially in the theater, was just such a sight to behold. The entire audience was just clapping enthusiastically. Black Panther, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, the Wasp, the rest of the Guardians, just seeing them all come back felt like I was witnessing a historic event take place. And the Avengers score playing in the background makes the scene even more epic. And as great as Infinity War was, we never really did get to see all of the main characters come together on screen fighting Thanos. The Battle of Wakanda was cool and all, but it didn't feel like a war, or had a lot of finality to it, since they were basically just fighting a small contingent of his forces. But this was it, the final battle we all truly wanted to see. There was no more setup. Everyone was finally here, and the actual battle itself is nothing less than a spectacle. Now, in this day and age, it's kind of difficult to be invested in big sci-fi battles that are the climax of a lot of movies because of how oversaturated and bloated they become. Big Hollywood blockbusters such as Independence Day Resurgence, Pacific Rim Uprising, and Justice League, and literally every other film in the DCEU have in a way made us numb to this, and they're all filled with things we're just sick to death of, like blue sky beams, huge space portals over a city, a bunch of mindless CGI city destruction, I'm not saying it still can't be done right, but you do have to do something uniquely creative and interesting for it to be fresh and engaging. And Endgame does all of these things. First of all, it has a safety net of being a massive team of all the characters we've come to love over the years. And second of all, it's just filled to the brim with so many amazing moments. Like, we finally get to see Spider-Man's instant kill mode in action as he just massacres a bunch of alien soldiers. It was cool to see the Black Order make return, as well as every other type of Thanos minion also comes back, like the Chitauri, the Space Leviathans, and the Outriders. I like how the film manages to introduce some new enemy types, like these cybernetic gorilla things and alien tanks. Ant-Man becomes Giant Man. We get to see him just step on all kinds of alien monsters. Scarlet Witch, in a way, gets her revenge against Thanos for killing the Vision. I thought it was cool to see Pepper Potts in her own little Iron Man suit fighting alongside everyone, because I kind of thought she was just annoying in the other films. I like how even though it's an all-out war, there's also the urgency that they have to get the gauntlet away from Thanos, and how they have to hand it to one another throughout all this chaos. The film continues to poke fun at fan theories and Doctor Strange tells Iron Man that this is the only way they could win. I only have one main issue with the overall battle itself, and that's when Captain Marvel destroys Thanos' ship. For one, her entrance is really cringy, and I think the ship being destroyed removes a lot of the tension from the actual battle itself. However, seeing Thanos punch her was amazing, so I guess it's fair. There's a small moment I've heard people complain about, and that's the scene where it's like all the female heroes teaming up for a brief moment. I've heard them say it's very feministy, but to be honest, I wasn't too bothered by it, since I just kind of viewed it as an extension of that similar scene in Infinity War in which all the females teamed up. Yeah, so needless to say, that didn't really get under my skin or irritate me. I probably wouldn't even mention it if it wasn't for the fact that Captain Marvel was there, but okay, that's enough Captain Marvel hate for a while. But honestly though, this whole battle ranks up there with some of the best climaxes in film history just because of all the finality it has to it. And it all wraps up perfectly in my eyes. I was at the edge of my seat when Thanos had the gauntlet in his hand, and I had genuinely no idea what was about to happen. It was almost a twist just to see Iron Man had taken the stones right before him. And I love it when he says, "I am Iron Man," as a nice little callback to the first movie. And when all of Thanos' forces begin to disintegrate around him, it's a rather poetic moment. By just looking at his face, you can tell he's devastated, but in a way accepting of this, as he sits down and says nothing as he too disintegrates. Now, in many finals to shows, movies, and other series, it's normally common for one of the main protagonists to die, and it's perfectly fitting that it would be Iron Man. This franchise started with him, and in a way, ended with him. The ultimate sacrifice, all the other characters around him, it's just perfect. Like Return of the King, the film just doesn't end after the final battle. It still does need to wrap up all the character arcs. The Iron Man funeral scene was done amazingly well, as we get a nice one-take, graceful shot showing all the other characters mourning him, as we hear a great voiceover from Tony Stark himself. I'm not crazy about Thor joining the Guardians of the Galaxy, but that's just a personal gripe, since as a comic fan, I don't like when characters switch over to different teams, because it makes the whole team lose a sense of identity. However, I do like how they are going to search out the 2014 Gamora, so I guess that sets up Guardians of the Galaxy 3 pretty well. I am not on board with him leaving Valkyrie in charge of New Asgard, mainly because for me she hasn't received enough screen time or character development to be worthy of this title. Maybe if she was with the Avengers when they went back on their little time travel adventure, I would have been okay with this, but as is, it just kind of comes out of nowhere and feels unearned. But the very ending of this easily makes up for all the tiny little gripes and nitpicks I have with the film. After Captain America returns the stones, he reappears as an old man with a shield. It's such a fulfilling conclusion to his character, as he finally got to live the life he never could. The makeup slash CGI on him looks very convincing, which is a nice contrast to how the MCU makes old actors look young. And him giving the shield to the Falcon is such a great way to pass on the torch to this next generation of Avengers. And I absolutely love how the film ends on a shot of a younger Steve Rogers slow dancing with Peggy Carter as the song "It's Been a Long, Long Time" plays in the background. For me, it makes the whole film an instant classic, like Infinity War. Now, if you couldn't already tell, I love this film, even with its small flaws, and I have just about no issue with it being 3 hours long, since I have the belief that any film can be as long as it needs to be, as long as you have a good enough story to tell. Now, the question is going to be asked, is it better than Infinity War? Though I can understand if someone thinks otherwise, for me, this is easily better in just about every way. The CGI and effects are better, the Avengers are given far more to do, the climax is more engaging, and I think it's just better just on character development alone. My only other small, tiny, minuscule issue with it is that I do kind of wish this was the last film in the MCU, especially since it doesn't even have an end credit scene. And maybe it could have been the last one if you were to change a few things. But then again, when you have a franchise that's made over $21 billion, it's pretty much staying here for life. That all being said, the sheer excellence of it honestly makes me never want to watch anything DC related again. From now on, this should be the prime example someone uses when trying to come up with a conclusion for a series. Take some notes, Game of Thrones. I would probably say it's not just one of the best superhero films of all time, but one of the best films of all time. Anthony and Joe Russo have done an outstanding job with this. The amount of build-up the film manages to pay off, only for it to far exceed my expectations, puts it up there. That's why this is the fulfilling conclusion to a series.